Good evening, everybody. This is Mike Kasoniak. I'd like to welcome Jason Miller, CFWI, FAA Safety Team instructor for IOPA's Air Safety Institute. Jason was named by the FAA as the Western Pacific CFI of the Year for 2009 and 2016. He is one of San Francisco Bay Area's leading certified flight instructors and the whole host of the Finer Points on YouTube. Welcome, Jason. Glad to have you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I feel I'm sitting in my RV tonight drinking a cup of tea, so this feels like an intimate gathering among friends. I like it. So tonight I wanted to talk to you all a little bit about, it's really from a book that I'm working on called The Top 10 Things All Pilots Should Know, but we're going to keep it to 5 tonight because that's about as far as I've gotten. And you know, I made a joke about stick and rudder. If you haven't seen this book, right, it's published in 1947, I think. And I've read it a dozen times and I still get stuff out of the book. And one of the things that jumps out at me is how long we've been trying to teach pilots to stay safe in airplanes. And when you think about, you know, what is excellence when it comes to being a pilot, what makes an excellent pilot? What are we all striving to become when we put in all these long, hard hours of work and go through everything we go through to become pilots? At the end of the day, you know, it's about staying safe in the airplane. It's about being able to continue to do the activity. And we have a tough time as flight instructors, for sure, teaching people any different than Wolfgang Langewiesche was trying to teach them in 1947. And even before that, a tough time teaching people how to do that. Loss of control is still the leading cause among aircraft accidents. And it's not just new pilots. I mean, I hear stories that haunt me, pilots with 16,000 hours and are current, you know, lose their motor on the upwind and will spin the airplane. How does that happen, right? How is it that we continue to make the same mistakes over and over and over again? So the 5 things that I wanted to present tonight are certainly not a comprehensive list. Like somebody joked up front, there's probably a lot more than 5 things you need to know to be a good pilot. But I believe that these 5 things, these small tweaks that you make to the way you approach flying will dramatically contribute to you being a safer pilot. As you can see, I don't have a fancy presentation. There's no whiteboard behind me. I don't have a keynote or anything that I'm going through here. So feel free to take notes as I talk. And we can start, you know, looking at what those things are. Whenever early on, I should say, in my flying career, it became obvious to me that there are certain things that professional pilots do and do very, very well that are just entirely absent from general aviation. And it shows. I mean, no one has a deep fear of buying an airline ticket and flying to Florida or wherever you might go. But I like to ask people to consider this question, you know, if somebody that you loved dearly, I think of my daughter or my wife, if they called me and said, hey, I'm going to buy an American Airlines ticket and I'm going to surprise you and fly home tonight, I'd say fine. But if they told me I met a really nice guy named Rick and he owns a Cessna 185 and he's going to fly me up from Florida, I would say, whoa, wait a minute, don't get in that airplane, right? So it's not like we don't know that this is an issue for us as a group. We know it. We're not oblivious to it. And I think it's wise to look at what the professional pilots do and what they do well that contributes to their being so much safer than we are. And the first one of the 5 things is a concept that I call bracketing safety. And it's a very simple, the idea of bracketing, does everyone know what bracketing is? Like when you're looking to hold a navigation course, right? You just kind of correct slowly and slowly and slowly until you find perfect. If the needle goes left, you turn to a heading that brings it closer to center. Maybe it goes too far right, so you turn a little bit right. And eventually you find that perfect heading, which holds the course, that holds the needle, and you've found perfect. And bracketing safety is one thing that professional pilots do very, very well. And it's a 3-step process, really. The process starts by first noticing everything that's going on in their world, like all the accidents. And if you have an accident for a commercial carrier or a cargo operator, anybody really in the professional world, if they have an accident, everything stops. The whole industry looks at that accident, not just the company, who had the accident, but every company looks at it, and they look at it in detail, and they, in some cases, reassemble airplanes inside of hangars and find flight data recorders and cockpit voice recorders. And we don't have all of that technology. But at the same time, I don't think we're looking close enough to see what is really going on. I get, texts all the time from pilots that I know saying, "Hey, did you hear about this thing?" Or students will come into my office and say, "Hey, did you see that a Seneca crashed over in Hayward last weekend?" And I would say 9.5 times out of 10, I had no idea that it happened. And it could be in my backyard. I mean, it could be 10 miles down the road, and I had no idea that the airplane went down. So you have to, step one of the bracketing safety process is being aware and maybe even building into your habit, if we can call flying a habit, build into your habit some review process. At the end of every month, sit down and look through the NTSB and figure out what accidents have happened. One of the things that you'll notice if you start doing that is that a large number of the accidents that happened in July happened also in June, and a large number of the accidents that happened in June happened in May, and so on. We're just continuing to repeat each other's mistakes. And it's not as though there aren't going to be new things that come up, or catastrophic engine failures, or whatever else it is that you have to deal with. But you can eliminate a huge number of issues if you just notice what somebody else has done before you. And so the professionals do that. They notice what's going on. And step two of their process then is they invent a procedure that prevents the possibility of that accident from ever happening again. And if you look in the United States, at least, it's pretty much, if you leave out the transoceanic thunderstorm and all those weird ones, but just look at the contiguous United States, it's pretty much once and done. I mean, in the last 30 or 40 years, I can think of 2 accidents that were basically repeats of accidents that had just happened. There was a MD-80 flap issue that happened in Texas and also in Detroit. There was a wind shear crash in the late 70s that also kind of repeated in the early 80s. But after that, it's pretty much once and done. So they notice what's happening. They invent a procedure that prevents the possibility of that thing from ever occurring again. They make that procedure redundant, and then they force compliance with the procedure among their pilot corps, and that's it. And over the last, I think they started in the early 90s, but over the last 30 years, commercial aviation has managed to reduce the fatal accident rate by 83%, which is just incredible. And when if you ask a lot of people, why is that? If you say, why is it that the commercial operators are so much safer? You might hear things like, well, they're flying jet airplanes, they have de-icing equipment, they've got 2 engines, these are pressurized aircraft. But anybody that's flown complex airplanes like that understands that complexity doesn't necessarily give you safety. In fact, it's counterintuitive, but the opposite is really true. A Cessna 152 is statistically one of the safest airplanes there is because there's very, very little to go wrong, right? So simple is actually safer. And we can't control the equipment we have to a large degree, but we can control our pilot behavior. And I would argue that in that 83% reduction in fatal accident rates, the commercial operators have done more to enhance safety by sort of disciplining pilot behavior or regulating pilot behavior than they have by adding fancy safety systems like stick pushers. I mean, Airbus is an example of that. There's all the fancy gadgetry in the world on an Airbus, but it's not necessarily safer than a 737. So that is the idea behind bracketing safety, and you can see examples of it all over. I mean, starting, I don't know when it started, but you can go as far back as like the Pacific Southern Airways crash down in Montgomery Field. I think that was before my time, right? In the 70s, where you had a 727 collide with a Cessna on a downwind for a runway. And I don't know all the details off the top of my head, but the basic idea behind the accident was you had off-duty crew members in the cockpit. They're talking about where they're going to go that night. They're on a right downwind. They're about 3,000 feet AGL. They're basically looking at the runway they're going to land on. So there's distractions in the cockpit. They get a traffic call for a Cessna that's climbing out at their 12 o'clock. So they're at the Cessna 6. Inside the Cessna, you've got an instructor and a student under the hood. And long story short, the two airplanes hit each other. But coming out of that, we get things like sterile cockpit. We make these rules. So below a certain altitude now, commercial operators aren't talking about anything other than the flight. There's no off-duty crew members in the cockpit. It gave us Class Bravo airspace in the Mode C ring. So all of a sudden we have transponders. And this process just continues. In 2007, in Lexington, Kentucky, there was a regional airliner. A lot of you probably remember this, but it took off on the wrong runway. It was at an airport with co-joined approach ends, and they wanted to be on this runway over here, but they actually got on this runway here. It was too short. And if you go back and look at what was happening again, there was no sterile cockpit, there was no pre-taxi briefing, there was no checking of the magnetic heading when they took the runway, all sorts of mistakes being made. But the thing that jumped out to me as a young pilot was I was flying corporate at the time, and I was in Santa Monica in the pilot's lounge, just hanging out with, there was executive jet pilots or net jet pilots, whatever they were at that point. There were other corporate flight department pilots in there, and we're all bored. No one's really talking. So I just said, hey, did you guys all see that crash down in Kentucky? And everyone said, oh yeah, yeah, we saw that. And I said, did anybody's procedures change as a result of that? And in unison, all of them, yeah. And I asked them what happens now. And so they all told the same story. Now we have to, the pilot flying has to call out the runway that we're going on, and the pilot monitoring has to verify it. The pilot flying has to check the magnetic heading. The pilot monitoring has to verify it. They started talking through this redundant procedure. So there's two of them, right? And it's two pilots usually in a commercial operation, usually. And they start talking through this redundant procedure. And sure enough, how many times has that happened since, right? How many times in the United States has a commercial operator taken the wrong runway and departed on the runway they didn't intend to depart on? I don't know of any. So I say, if it's not broke, don't fix it, right? Like if they're doing it right and they're getting it right and it's statistically measurable in their results, then let's emulate what those pilots are doing. And that starts with noticing what's going on in the real world, inventing procedures that will prevent us from making mistakes that pilots before us have made. Then here comes the really hard part for most of us, making that procedure redundant and forcing compliance. And that is really the challenge. It's easy to sit here in the comfort of my RV and say, oh, sure, I would never do this. If the weather's like that, then I'm not going to go, and to say all these things. But the real challenge for us as non-regulated Part 91 pilots flying by ourselves with external pressures is to make the procedure redundant. Redundancy is very difficult in a single pilot world, and probably even harder forcing our own compliance. So let's just talk briefly about redundancy, because again, along the ideas that if it's not broke, don't fix it, you can take these procedures from single pilot commercial operations. And that's basically what I did. So as my career evolved and I'm meeting pilots like the ones I met in Santa Monica, I started seeking out single pilot operators, companies like Ameriflight or Pac Valley or anybody local that I could find that would be willing to share their SOPs with me, and just adopted them, just borrowed them. And those folks, those single pilot commercial operators that are out there flying high performance piston twins with deferred maintenance items and low IFR day and night, those folks are some of the best pilots around. And those procedures are really solid. So those are procedures that are designed to build redundancy into a single pilot world. And I always say, like, you have to be like a camel when it comes to redundancy. There's not a lot of it around. You have to find that water and that redundancy anywhere you can and pack it in and bring it with you. And there are little tricks for redundancy, and two, just as an example. One is the idea that you're not going to read a checklist the way a crew reads a checklist. And if you think about the way we're taught to read checklists, for the most part, it's like you pick up the checklist and you say, all right, power and mixture and cowl flaps and gear, and you're just sort of reading this list. When you read it like that, it's really what we would call a do list. It's an item that you read, it's a thing that you do. It's an item that you read, it's a thing that you do. But if there's any CFIs here, I know you've had the same experience that I've had when you're sitting in the right seat, is you watch somebody skip a line, completely miss an item. I mean, literally just skip the line, Their thumb moves down 2 spaces and they're still reading that list. And I'm thinking, this isn't a checklist, right? Who's there to check that they didn't skip that line, right? This is just a do list. So that is just one example. The way you use a checklist is one example of how we take this procedure from a crew environment and try to just adopt it into a single pilot environment, and it doesn't really work. So what we want to do in a single pilot environment, what those single pilot commercial operators would train you to do, is to guess at it first and then check it second. And it's done 2 ways. You can either do a flow check just around the cockpit for a thing like a, I wouldn't do it before landing, but like a climb checklist. You just do a little flow check and just guess at it. If you miss something, it's not important because you're about to pick up a piece of paper and verify as a redundant check that you didn't miss anything. GUMPS is a really great example of this. If anybody uses the GUMPS check as a pre-landing checklist, that is an acronym, but it's the same idea. It's a guess first and a check second. And by the way, if you're doing flow checks, I would recommend keeping the flow check standard. So I've read books where they'll try to get you to learn flow checks for tons of different things. There's like the pre-maneuver flow, there's the engine failure flow, there's the cabin fire flow, you end up having to remember so many flows that it really defeats the purpose. In a light airplane, you should be able to find a pattern that walks you around the room, right? That has you look at everything in the cockpit and at least consider, does this thing need to be dealt with now? I'm looking at my engine gauges. Those always need to be reviewed. Can't do that too much, so make that part of the flow. But do the lights need to be touched? Maybe, maybe not. How's the power, right? How's the cowl flaps, the gear, anything else you have to deal with? And then the most important part is make it redundant, pick up a checklist and read that second. I have a lot of students that drop that second part. They'll just sort of memorize the flow. I'd rather have you read the list than memorize the flow, but remember, we're going for something that's redundant is the whole point of it. So really work to do both things. Another way that you can be redundant in a single pilot world, and what those commercial operators would tell you, is to talk out loud, right? Like, believe it or not, this is the camel in the desert idea, but your ears can check your mouth, right? Your ears can hear what you're saying and recognize that something's wrong. We all know this, like when we call somebody by the wrong name, we say like, hey, how you doing, Paul? And the minute you say Paul, you realize it's John, but you didn't really know that until you like heard yourself say it. So speaking out loud slows your brain down and allows your ears to cross-check your mouth, which gives you some measure of redundancy. And so if you go to one of these cargo companies I described, they're flying single pilot, so they'll teach you a set of callouts, say for takeoff, power set, gauges checked, aboard speed, rotate, no runway. And if you go back 6 months later after flying by yourself, certainly if you miss one of those items, you're going to be kind of brought back into, no, you have to say that item. But even if you change the wording, like if you say you're supposed to say no runway and you say out of usable runway, gear up, they will still constrain you back into, no, it's no runway here at this company, right? So they're very strict about making sure that their pilots are talking out loud, doing it regularly, and saying exactly what they want them to say. And there's a reason, right? We covered that up front. The reason is these methods have proven superior. And I think, if I didn't say it earlier, I think it's because the companies, if you just think about it logically, the companies survive the crashes. I mean, the problem with, the guy that crashed his Mooney down in Southern California 4 months ago or whatever it was, is there's no company to survive that. There's nobody to take that learning and carry it forward. But in the cases of these single pilot operators, the company lives through it. The company learns from it. They've got money on the line. They've got airplanes on the line. They've got pilots on the line. It's in their interest to make sure that never happens again. So we can sort of borrow that idea. And that's bracketing safety. And that's a concept that I think we would all do well to sort of borrow from. And by the way, I do have a book on this topic. So if we only get through, there's an older book called Setting the Standard on Standard Operating Procedures for General Aviation Pilots that goes way deeper on that. But the second thing, number 2, let's see if we can get through 5. Number 2, standardize your flying, right? So standardization is really become a thesis for me, a theme of everything that I have tried to teach my students and what I believe contributes to that first thing, that bracketing safety. And we talked about a couple bits of standardization, like flow checks and checklists or takeoff callouts. But if you think about what standardization does in a deeper way, there's a few things I just want to point out if you haven't thought about it this way before. And this might sound a little bit out there, but I think if as we talk about it, you'll get where I'm coming from. But there's almost like a ritual transformation that happens for pilots if you do things the same way every time. And that's not really my idea. I mean, if anybody who's like, if there's any law enforcement officers or anybody that's ever served in the military, you know that like putting on that uniform, going through the ritual of putting on your uniform transforms you into the thing that you were trained to be. This is not arbitrary that you wear that uniform. For a short time in my past, I went to a private school and we had a dress code. We had to wear ties or whatever, sweaters. There was a whole code of things we had to wear. But every now and again, they would give us what they called a grub day. They would just say, you can wear whatever you want. And I noticed immediately that on grub days, I couldn't really think about school. And not only could I not think about school, but nobody in my class could think about school. Just because on that day, we were wearing t-shirts and sweatpants instead of button-up shirts, ties, and coats, right? So we were conditioned to feel like students when we wore a certain thing. And, if as you as you walk up to the airplane and the pre-flight starts and you have this ritual that you're going through, it's why you've heard people say, if you're doing the pre-flight and someone distracts you, then you should start the pre-flight over, because it's your ritual, right? You're transforming yourself. I had one student in my career so far, knock on wood, one student crashed an airplane and he was okay, but he totaled the airplane. Everybody was okay, which is, we're all grateful for that. But when I asked him to sort of describe to me what happened when you had this accident, he told me all sorts of things. Like he had a board meeting call, and he was on the phone. He's standing outside the airplane. His girlfriend was late, and she shows up, and she's having issues with her roommate. And there's just all these external pressures, and they were getting a late start, so they had to jump in the plane and go. It was like everything you wouldn't want to see leading up to a flight. And those things are going to exist. So you need some anchor, you need some touchstone that you can sort of fall back into to start going through your ritual. So the ritual transformation of standardizing your flying. The other thing that standardization does, and this is going to sound counterintuitive, but it will liberate you. It will make you feel free as a pilot. And I don't know if there's any musicians in this Zoom, but I happen to be a musician. I'm from Chicago. There's a lot of blues music in Chicago. And one thing that blues music, like about blues music, is it all sounds the same, right? It really does, because blues music is pretty much the same. Like I could grab a guitar, I could go into a club, somebody could say, hey, we're playing 12-bar blue in E, and 12-bar blues in E. And I know exactly what the song, I know how it's going to go. The reason I know how it's going to go is it's an improvisational art form. So in order to improvise, in order to make up stuff out of nowhere and do things that have never been done before, you have to know what the concrete structure is. So once you know where the structure is going, once I know what the chord progression is going to do, without a doubt, I know where it's going. Now all of a sudden I'm free to do whatever I want around it. If I didn't know where it was going, I would be wondering constantly, like, well, where's that going to go and what's going to happen? And I think the same is true of flying, that if you're a conscientious pilot and you do care about a safe operation and you don't have any form, then you're constantly sort of wondering and kind of scattered, and not wondering so much, but it's like, I could be doing anything. I could be checking this thing, or I could be checking that thing, or doing whatever in the airplane. But if you give yourself a concrete structure, then it allows gaps in that structure that free you up to sort of improvise around it. Some of those structures we talked about, right? Like takeoff callouts, flow checks and checklists, which I ask of my students. I ask for a flow check and a checklist for every climb, every level off, every descent, and every level off. And it's a fixed number of things that can happen in a flight. And there's only so many climbs, level offs, and descents. So I keep track of it, and I expect them all to be redundant. And no one gets there, by the way. No one does 100%. I don't do 100%. Nobody does. But it's like a company that's not growing is dying. A pilot that is not working for perfection is falling backwards. And when pilots contact me and say, hey, can we go do like an assessment flight? And we have this conversation right here where I say, like, do you use checklists? And they say, yeah. And I talk about why it's important and the redundancy and the whole thing. And then we actually get in the airplane, and their pilot mind starts doing the primacy thing that they've always done. Most pilots are hitting about 10% of the opportunities. So if you go for 100, you might get up into the 65, 70% of the possible checklists being done. And I picked those climb, level off, descent, level off moments for a reason. Those are the events where something happens. The power changes, the mixture changes, the cowl flaps change. It's always a good excuse to look at the engine. So back to that blues analogy, if that's your primacy, if that's the way you fly and you've worked on that, so every time I climb, I go through this flow check and I do a checklist, it frees you up to sometimes maybe not pick up the list. You can improvise. You can call an audible. You can say, you know what, I'm getting out of this airport. There's like 100 airplanes around right now. I'm in the climb. I'm just going to do the flow check with my eyes, and I'm not going to pick up that list right now. But it becomes an exception to the form that you've made concrete for yourself instead of just forgetting a checklist. And there's a huge difference there. So some of the other ones, while we're on standardizing flying, is our if you're not doing these, like a pre-taxi briefing is a great one. If folks are using ForeFlight these days, taxi diagrams are everywhere. It used to be that you had to really think ahead to put a taxi diagram on your lap, but now every iPad or whatever tool you're using, even the panel mounted GPS, they all have taxi diagrams. So if you have any device like that, you can access those. Take a moment before you taxi, look at the diagram and just sort of brief yourself on the route. Make sure there's no hot spots, or if there are, you know where they are. A pre-takeoff briefing. If I had $1 for every pilot that, when the run-up was complete, looked at me and said, "Are you ready?" And I say, "Oh yeah, I'm ready," and then they just key the mic and call the tower, I would be rich, right? It's like most pilots don't just take a moment and get in front of the airplane. So I always joke with students, like, if you can't get in front of it when it's not moving, we're really in trouble, right? Like, we're not even going anywhere. Let's get in front of the airplane. Let's think about this next minute like we're going to have an engine failure, or it doesn't even have to be the disastrous things, like what's 1,000 feet above the airport. If we're flying around and Chicago's 762 feet above sea level, right? So 1760 is 1,000 feet up. And if you're flying in California, where I am, where we're always taking off at sea level, it's even more important to practice these things. Or if you're flying at an airport with one taxiway, it's more important for you to be diligent about picking up your taxi diagram. Nobody who's training at Oakland International is going to think it's funny to pick up a taxi diagram. That's going to be built into their program easily. But when you're flying where there's not a lot of taxiways, then all of a sudden you go pick up your buddy at McCarran one day, it's not going to be a part of your thinking, right? Go down to Grand Junction, or you guys are in Colorado. I'll try to use Colorado airports, but you go to some bigger airport, you're gonna, you want that to be a part of your program, especially if you have to think ahead to get those diagrams. Pre-takeoff briefing. We talked about flow checks, checklists. We talked about takeoff callouts. And again, there's I'm not going to bog down there, but there's ways that all of that that goes deeper, right? Like in your pre-takeoff briefing, you're deciding abort points on the runway, and then in your callouts, you're making callouts that tie back to the pre-takeoff briefing. And for anybody that's a fast writer, I'll tell you what I would put in a pre-takeoff briefing, and then we'll move on. I usually review 4 things and then emergencies. So the 4 things, and I borrowed this from 2007, Lexington, Kentucky. I visually identify the runway that I'm taking off on, and I say it out loud because there's no pilot monitoring. I'm here at runway 30. I look at the entrance. I make sure I understand how to get on the runway. And again, if you fly at the same airport all the time, it's more important that you do it, because it's easy to slack off at your own airport, and that becomes your primacy. That's what sticks with you as the form. So the runway entrance, get on there. The next thing is the winds. Visually identify the winds. You don't know where the ASOS is. You don't know when the ATIS was taken. Visually identify a wind socket. Make sure that you understand what the winds are doing. Pick an abort point on the runway. Halfway point works well, but if you don't have 70% of your takeoff speed, By that point, you're going to abort the takeoff and try again. That comes from mountain flying. It's a good rule to keep you safe. And if it's, again, you can call an audible. If you're taking off on a 6,000 foot runway, you don't have to call out the halfway point necessarily. You can make an exception, but only make the exception if these rules are the form you have, right? Otherwise, you're not playing blues, you're playing jazz. Whole different thing. 1,000 feet above the field. That's the fourth thing. What is 1,000 feet above the ground? Because that's the point at which I will feel free to change power, transition to a cruise climb, and run that first climb checklist. Flow check first, checklist second. 1,000 feet, put that in the bank. Dick Collins used to say, don't change the power below 1,000 feet. Statistically, that's a bad idea. So just keep everything the same, climb at your best rate of climb speed up to 1,000. And that's the altitude that I use for sterile cockpit. So if, the airlines use 10,000 in GA, I use 1,000. So at 1,000 feet, we shallow the climb, we'll do the flow check checklist, and then we're free to not have a sterile cockpit. So that's the four things, and then the emergencies. Now, when I get on the runway, if I have an engine failure, what are the things I'm going to touch? And actually touch them, find them, make sure you can get to them. John Denver, fuel off up here, right? Whatever it is. If that's his program, maybe he would have found the fuel selector and thought ahead about it before actually departing. So that's the idea. Again, on the runway, after rotation with no runway remaining, after rotation with runway remaining, then up to 1,000. And there are more, but let's move on to personal minimums. So what does this all boil down to for the commercial operators? Like if you look at the way, again, back to that 83% reduction in fatal accidents, the airlines are able to constrain pilot behavior and make really tough decisions black and white. If you're an airline pilot and you're here, you know that if you're about to fly an approach and you haven't crossed the final approach fix and the reported weather drops below minimums, you are not legally allowed to fly that approach. You can't do it. You can't think about it. You can't go down and take a look. It's the decision's been made for you. So you have other options and other things to think about. It can put yourself fully into another plan of action. I remember flying in the Bay Area. I got caught out on a stormy night one night with a student. We actually got caught out in weather that was a bit more than we were bargaining for, but there we were. We're up there dealing with it. And I was hearing all these Southwest jets and they're all having to hold. And one call on the radio, this guy said, hey, look, we can do like another turn in the hold, but in about 4 minutes here, we're going to have to go to our alternate. And it jumped out at me because he didn't have a choice. This is not an airline pilot, or maybe it was, but he could easily have not had a choice, right? If you get to a certain point, if X, then Y, right? If we get to a certain amount of fuel, we must, according to the operations manual, according to that manual that survived decades of accidents with the company and is now here to protect me, according to that manual, I have to do this next thing. So in GA, we don't have that regulation. We're not that regulated. So we have to invent those things for ourselves. We have to come up with personal minimums and force ourselves to stick to them. And that, again, is the hardest part. I can't really underline that enough. I remember I don't own a motorcycle anymore because I can't tell you how many times I'd always be a really good, careful rider until one day I had to be across town and I only had 10 minutes to do it. And I would ride in such a way that would make me get off the bike and say, I'm never riding that way again. But I was unable to stop, so I don't have motorcycles anymore. That's the challenge, constraining yourself when there are pressures on you. You have to just make the promise that it's black and white. I have a rule about personal minimums. I will never change them on the day I'm going to fly, even if it's the right thing to do to change them. So I have students that we sometimes cancel lessons. They'll come in for a lesson with me and, we talk for a half hour before the lesson. We pre-flight the airplane. It's been maybe an hour and 15 minutes of their time, of my time, and I have a limit. If the winds are gusting more than 24 knots, we're not going to go. And if they're gusting 23, we will. So, these students sometimes come down and they're anxious to fly. I know they want to fly, and we'll get in the airplane, we'll fire up the engine, we'll turn on the ATIS, and sure enough, it's gusting 25. And we have to cancel. We have no choice but to get out of the airplane and say, 2 knots too much, right? We were going to go, we invested this time, but now we can't go because it's 25. If you don't do that, it's a pretty slippery slope. Like you will always just make it okay until it's not okay anymore. So personal minimums can work for you the same way they work for the operations manual of an airline. They have to be thought through kind of in the comfort of your home, as we're doing tonight. Think them through, write them down, and in a perfect world, give them to a pilot you respect. So if you have an instructor or a friend or somebody who's like in on this game of staying alive in the airplane with you, give them a copy of your personal minimums, so that if you're ever tempted to break your personal minimums, you can call them and say, what was that wind limit again? Or if they ever find out, they're always in the back of your mind, there's some measure of accountability. If I take off today and I spin out and have a little ground loop or something, and my friend Bill finds out that it was gusting 27 when he knows my minimums are 20, I'm gonna look silly. So maybe there's something there for you. All right, flying with passengers and kids. Oh boy, I hope everybody has that mute button, that intercom isolation button where you can just shut everybody else out. That is going to be by far the most important tool to desaturate yourself in the airplane when you're flying with passengers and kids. There's an accident from 2011 in a Cirrus where a guy is flying his two daughters to college in the Midwest. The Air Safety Institute did a video on it. I think it's on their YouTube channel if you can find it. I don't remember the name of it. But anyway, long story short, he doesn't have an instrument rating. He's flying from Indiana to the Chicagoland area. He's going to drop off one of his daughters at college, and his other daughter and her boyfriend came along for the ride. And there are a number of radio transmissions that I listened to, and the narrator of the story makes it seem like this guy's acting cavalier, or that he's somehow thick and doesn't really get what's going on. But I've heard this so many times in presentations that I've done that I have a different theory. I think he's trying to sound cool in the airplane. I think he's afraid to sound what he's really feeling, because in a general aviation cockpit, everybody can hear everything. And if this guy keys the mic and says, I need help, like I need someone to kind of talk me down, tell me where to go, I'm like in over my head. His daughters hear it, his daughter's boyfriend hears it. I mean, everybody in the airplane hears it. So if you have the ability to isolate yourself in the airplane and make your own cockpit sterile, give yourself a little bubble, make sure you explain to your passengers that that's a tool that you have and that you might actually deploy. Know how to use it, and don't be afraid to use it from the ground to 1,000 feet. If they really need you, tell them to tap you on the shoulder, but it better be something good. The other thing is briefing everybody is a bit of an art, right? You want to make sure that you're the safest pilot out there, but if you start talking about engine failures and engine fires and all this stuff that's going to go on, it can sometimes create an awkward cockpit environment, which I don't know that I understand. I come from the sailing world. Has anybody ever gone out on a boat with a sailor? Not so much power boaters, but sailors. And there's always a skipper's briefing. I mean, it's like the first thing that happens before you leave the dock. You're all ready to leave the dock, and you gather there in the cockpit, and the skipper gives you some sort of safety briefing. Says, okay, I want you on this line. Here's what we're going to do if somebody goes overboard. Here's what we're going to do if this thing happens. And I think we could learn a lot. I don't have any magic tricks about it, but I would just want to encourage you to maybe look into some of those skippers briefings. I'm sure there's some on YouTube. Just search sailor skipper briefing, safety briefing, and maybe we can just learn to develop something like that, so that we're not just jumping in the airplane and crossing our fingers and sort of hoping for the best. All right, you guys, I'm going to talk about one more thing here, and then I'm going to take some questions and join my family inside for dinner. But the other one is, this is like a very simple thought, but I believe in it. Years ago, I had a couple students, and I worry about California pilots with weather sometimes. Like I trained in Chicago, where the weather can come at you from any direction at any time with any level of severity. You never know where it's coming from. You don't have to tell a pilot in Chicago to get a weather briefing before the flight. That's not a thing there. But here in California, it's a little bit different. I can tell you for sure what the weather is going to be like on July 6th, at least in the Bay Area. I can tell you it's going to be foggy till about 12:30 or 1 p.m. And then it's going to be clear, sunny, and windy. And I know that with a lot of certainty. I would put money on that fact. So when that's the reality, when weather is that predictable, it becomes your primacy. Again, if you're training on the one runway, you need the taxi briefings. If training. 1,000 things are built in. We're going to fly out to Virginia and fly them back across the country. It's going to be like a 3-week trip. Is there anything, can we take you out to lunch and can you tell us anything about cross-country flying? So like a setup, right? I'm going to go have lunch with them and try to explain to them how to get these airplanes from Virginia to California. So I'm wrestling with this, thinking like, what is one thing I could tell these guys? Just one thing that would make a difference that they'll actually remember. There's no way we can do any amount of instruction that's, I can't go into the details. So that one thing is make the decisions on the ground. Like if they're tough decisions, and I don't know how to define a tough decision, but if you're flying along and it's an obvious one would be one you don't agree on. But another thing would be something you talk about for too long. Like you're trying to decide something. Should we go? Should we press on? Should we land at this airport? Should we get some fuel? Are you sure the weather, are we sure we know what the weather's going to do? Should we go take a look? Should we come back? Make those decisions on the ground at an FBO. And if the right thing to do is go back, jump in the plane and continue the flight, you will go back, jump in the plane and continue the flight. But fatigue is an insidious thing. It's a really tough thing to self-analyze fatigue. I'm not proud of it, but I can tell you, I can sit here right now tonight and I won't bore you, but I can tell you 20 different stories of times I got out of an airplane and said I was too tired to be flying. But I don't think, and this is the part I'm not proud of, it's just true, I don't think I could tell you one story, not even one, when the mission really, really mattered, that I said to myself, I'm a little too tired to be flying. I'm going to cancel because I'm too tired. I don't think I've ever said that. So the data on that's not good. Like I said, I'm not proud. That's just the data. So if that is the data, we have to try to somehow combat fatigue and external pressures. And we do that external pressure stuff through all the standardization and stuff I'm talking about. But when it comes to fatigue, if you find yourself flying along, make the tough decisions with your wheels on the ground. All right, wow, you guys all sat through that. Does anybody have any questions or anything you want me to dig into a little bit? I don't know how to do the Zoom hands up thing if that's what's happening. So you might just have to jump in.
This is Mike.
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead, Martin.
well, I was just going to say, anybody with a question can, in kind of orderly fashion, just unmute and speak your question. But Mike, did you have a different idea?
No, I just had I've been watching some of your videos, Jason. And the one thing that I might have missed the one where you talked about this, but you referred to a Lindbergh reference.
Yes. Yeah, it's a name that I gave to the front corner of any airplane. Like it's not a new idea. Like Rod Machado has some videos on it. I used to call it the golden reference, but it is, I believe that for every problem in an airplane, there's a solution called where you look and when you look there. And so often I see the nose come up, and there are many times the nose of the airplane comes up where you can't see over the airplane. And all too often I see people kind of doing this thing where they're like just struggling to see over the nose of the airplane. And what will inevitably happen is you will stop pulling when you can't see over the plane, over the nose of the airplane anymore. If that's your reference, if your reference in flight is over the nose of the airplane and that's all you've got, and I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with over the nose of the airplane when it's easy to see over the nose of the airplane. Certainly look straight ahead if that's what you've got. But slow flight, climbs, the flare, flying tail draggers, right? Anywhere where the nose of the airplane comes up and all you've got is blue sky in front of you, you need to know where to look. And where you look is the corner of the front window. Or if there's not a corner of the front window, like in a Cessna 152, if you sit back far enough, you can actually look forward out the side window. But you're still looking forward, only you're looking where the horizon hits the side of the airplane or the side of the cowling. And I call it the Lindbergh reference because it's catchy. And Charles Lindbergh famously said, "I'm used to flying with bags of mail in front of me. I don't need a front window." Because he was doing that. He was flying these biplanes with bags of mail in front of him, and he would just look at where the horizon hit the side of the bag of the mail. And you can see everything there: pitch, yaw, roll. And so, next time you're out there doing slow flight, or go practice this, just try it, slow the airplane down so that you can't see over the nose of the airplane. and just focus on the Lindbergh reference and play with the right rudder, hold the right rudder until the airplane, is flying straight, then let go of it and you'll be shocked. All the data is right there where you need it. And you need to make yourself comfortable with that reference so that you're not that person sort of sitting up and stretching and trying to see over the nose of the airplane, that you have options. You feel comfortable there at the Lindbergh reference the same way you do looking over the nose.
Okay. All right.
I know from my perspective, the checklists are definitely something that I continue to work on to reinforce on an ongoing basis. Because in my primary training, it was never really enforced.
Yeah.
And even now, I mean, I think back on my last flight, I was out with a friend of mine, and we certainly did the pre-flight briefing before we left. But when we landed and then we were getting ready to come back, I just kind of breezed through everything, didn't really use the checklist. And, when we got back, I sort of did a post-flight debriefing with the guy that I went with. And I'm like, so here's the things that I missed on this flight because I didn't do the checklist.
Right.
And, it's the list gets embarrassing at some point in time. So,
at least you're doing, the analysis after the fact.
Well, should be doing it before I leave.
Yeah. Checklists are a funny
know,
thing. When I first met my the guy that ended up sort of becoming my mentor, he was pretty strict dude. But the first flight I had with him, he grabbed the checklist out of my hand and said, "Start the airplane." And it was a eye-opening experience because I had been flying at that point for over a year, for like a year and a half. But I kind of didn't know where to start. I'd never started the airplane without the checklist before. So his point was made, and his point was, you've just been reading this list. You have no idea really like what you're doing. So not only is it not redundant, but your brain's on autopilot when you read that thing. So that was probably one of my early introductions to the idea that we tend to use them wrong, even when we're using them in a single pilot world.
Yeah, and I like how you have it reinforced in a lot of your videos too.
Trying, not always, but I'm trying.
My question was about the order of things in a checklist. I mean, a lot of times, I'm checking the right flap and I'm right there next to the main gear right side. And so I check the tire and brake, but that's not the order that's in the checklist. Is that a bad thing to do?
No, that wouldn't be a hill that I would die on. I would just tell you that if I was your instructor, I would expect you to do it the same way every time. So we could make a deal where you change it because you like that better, but that's what I'm going to hold you to. So like some students of mine would say, I prefer to get to the airplane and check the fuel and the oil right away, because if there's no fuel, I want to call the fuel truck. And while the fuel truck's coming, I'm going to pre-flight the rest of the airplane. And that's fine. Then check the fuel and the oil first. But every single time we fly, I'm going to make sure that you're checking the fuel and the oil first. So whatever your ritual is, keep it a ritual.
Your point about writing down the personal minimums, I think, is extremely important, because if you don't have it written down, you have this normalization of deviance problem where
100%.
things just slip.
Yeah. Even when you do write it down, sometimes it's just, struggling to come up with any tool that you can to hold yourself accountable. And you're never gonna, like in flight training, where I spend a lot of my time, I call it flying in a fishbowl. Like, it's real easy to go out there and demonstrate great aeronautical decision making. Oh no, the winds are blowing too strong, we're not going to fly today. That's never going to be the time that you normalize deviance. It's going to be, there was one flight I did where, it was kind of a long story, but I was with my family in Southern California. We were supposed to stay at a hotel, and it didn't work out. They didn't have a room, and they screwed up the reservation, whatever it was. We had to leave the hotel. There was 45 minutes of sunlight left, and my mother-in-law in Palm Springs said, "Come over here." So it's about a 45-minute flight, and I jumped in the plane, and there we go. I said, "Okay, fine, we're in an airplane. We can go to Palm Springs." The fog was, rolling into the LA area. It was already going over the Banning Pass, if you know where that is. And, before too long, I was doing something that I couldn't really believe I was doing, especially with my family on board. And so it's how did I get in that situation? I mean, I was angry that the hotel screwed up the reservation. I was rushing to get to my mother-in-law's. The GPS, when I was going through the Banning Pass, doing something I never should have done, said 7 minutes to my destination. 7 minutes. You know, like I can't hit a mountain with 7 minutes to go, right? So those are the times you're going to do stupid things, when all the pressure is on you. And I think that finding any tool that we can to write our minimums down, the things we're never going to do, send them to somebody, hold ourselves accountable. I don't know if everybody has those personality flaws that I just described, but I need every arrow in my quiver, you know.
How do you handle the taxi diagram function? So I always feel like I'm given, taxi instructions when I land, and I feel like tower or ground, tower is expecting me to execute on those pretty much right away. I mean, do you just basically take the time you need and you kind of map it out on ForeFlight, or how do you do that?
It doesn't really take long, and a lot of times it's an almost arbitrary exercise. I mean, back to the idea that you can sort of skip it and normalize that, although that's not particularly deviant. But if you want to build it into your program, you just have to do it every time, and it's pretty quick. If you're a ForeFlight user, you just tap where you are, like zoom it in and just say, okay, we're going down taxiway Charlie. There's no hotspots, left on Bravo, and cross, a runway or whatever, and we're there. But when you look back at that 2007 crash in Kentucky, I have a hard time believing that if there was a detailed professional briefing on the fact that those runways had co-joined approach ends, that accident ever would have happened. I mean, there's so many things that would have derailed that accident, that would have, moved the Swiss cheese or broken the chain. But two professional pilots looking at a diagram saying, okay, these two runways have these co-joined approach ends. Let's make sure that when we turn on and we get on the right one, would have been all it would have taken to break that chain. That just didn't happen.
Asking for progressive when you land, unless it's really your familiar airport, home airport,
Right.
you could be asking for trouble, because you just said two pilots looking down. Are you kidding?
Yeah. Well, you brought up a point, is like, I try whenever possible not to look down. So I do fly with an iPad these days, but it's an iPad mini for a reason, so that I can hold it up as much as possible. This whole like head down in the lap thing with the iPads is a problem. When we had paper, I mean, I would have gotten a hit in the back of the head from, like, Richard would have just whacked me in the back of the head if I put my head down in my lap and started reading paper. You hold it up where your eyes are, you don't want to cover the window, but hold it up by the flight instrument so you can see out if somebody's going to come near you, or if the airplane starts moving. As much as possible, just avoid that head down thing. It's really hard with an iPad like the one I'm talking to you guys on. It's heavy. So,
I would
Question
say
of
you're
personal
talking about,
minimums. Go ahead, Joe.
you were talking about the Lindbergh spot. I would suggest very, very strongly, based on my own experience, unfortunately, that you practice that. Practice it during the day, practice it at night, practice it at various altitudes with various normal maneuvers. And if you are a right seat, I'm not a pilot, I'm a right 1500 hours right seat 182. Get your pilot, I'll go out with your pilot and practice it. And you're looking at the right seat at the same sort of point and under the same sort of quite differing conditions. Because if it comes to pass that you really, truly, really need it, and you haven't a clue what things actually look like that, it's not a help.
yeah, that's great. That's a great suggestion. And what I'll do, there's two things I do with students to help them learn it the way you just described. One is bring a dry erase marker and literally just draw on the window there, so they can really start to use it and see through the mark like it's a gun sight, and see the land behind it or the sky behind it and what's happening to the airplane. The other thing is high-speed taxis in a soft field takeoff configuration, where we just go down the length of an entire runway without ever seeing over the nose. Do that at a towered airport if you can, so that someone has your back, but just really low power setting, 11, 1200 RPM. You don't want to lift off. If you're the instructor, you've got the power. and just ride a wheelie all the way down the runway. And I get my students to kind of go from one side to the other so they can see what that looks like when the edge gets closer, when the edge goes farther away. If you do that a few times, that's the end of a landing. That's what the flare should look like. It'll start to burn in, you know, and they'll start to really understand it.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Jason, I was going to ask you about personal minimum or minimums.
Sure.
I mean, the standard things that I think of in that list are crosswinds, gusts, ceilings. Do you have a recommendation for what things should be in your list of personal minimums, or can you, supply a reference to a good one that you know of?
I don't have, like, it's not the same for everybody. I mean, I use, you build these things up. Like, do you guys know Julie Clark, air show performer? Anyway, she retired a couple of years ago, but we kind of became friendly because I did a YouTube video with her, and I went to the last time she performed at Sun and Fun. I was standing on the ground, and I remember like watching her come around this loop, and she was so low to the ground that, like, knowing her and caring about her, like I was like, my heart skipped a beat. I was like, oh, she's gonna lose it here, right? Just 12 inches off the ground. I mean, mowing the lawn. And that was comfortable for her. That was a minimum. Like, she knew what she was doing. She had done that so many times throughout an entire career that was something that I would never have attempted. And, minimums can be a bit like that also. So, like for me, I don't fly IFR in airplanes without de-icing equipment when the freezing levels are below, or when the freezing levels are at or below the MEAs. So I don't want to pick up ice in an airplane that doesn't have de-icing equipment. I know some other pilots may not feel that way. I have a friend who races at Reno, but he owns a tail dragger, and he doesn't want to land off airport in some of these fields like a bunch of other guys do. Certainly he could. He's got the skills for it. And I asked him, why don't you want to do that? And his answer is, I might like pop a tire, break my plane, get stuck out there. He's like, I just don't need the risk. So, personal minimums, like Bob Hoover said, that you're going to stay safe as a pilot if you fly within your own limits and within the limits of the airplane. And limits of the airplane, even that varies just a little bit depending on who the pilot is, but certainly your own limits are different for everybody. So it's really, really hard to say, and it doesn't have to make sense. It can be like Justin, who races at Reno and flies jets during the day and flies his little 120 all over the Sierras. He just wants to land on a runway and not off airport, and that's fine. So where do you go to get them is a bit of a tough one. I really advocate making a relationship with an instructor that's different than the model we currently have. Again, just sort of emulating professionals trying to do what they do. They go back for training every 6 months. So this idea that we have a CFI, we get our certificate, and we don't see another CFI for 2 years doesn't seem to be the best way to go. And if you are a new pilot, it's easy. Your instructor gives you your minimums. You walk out the door, whatever your solo limits were, I would say, are your minimums until your next 6-month checkup. And when you do the 6-month checkup, maybe then you can talk to your instructor about increasing the minimums. When it comes to things like IFR, like I just described, I teach for the freezing levels at or below the MEAs, significant yellow radar returns along the route of flight, weather below the approach back into the airport that I'm departing from, and surface winds in my neighborhood in excess of 25 knots. But again, those are different for everybody. The winds might be different. If I flew in South Dakota or Wyoming instead of California, we've got a lot of bumpy ground here, and anything above 25 knots, I just know what that's going to feel like because I've done it, and it's not a place I want to be twice. Anyway, you guys, I have to go in and eat dinner with the family. I really appreciate the invite tonight. LearnTheFinerPoints.com is my website. And if you go to LearnTheFinerPoints.com/Lindbergh reference, there's a page there that describes everything we were talking about in the Lindbergh reference for anybody that wants to check that out.
I popped in one of your videos when you discussed it in the chat.
Oh, great. But I really appreciate the invite. Thank you all very much. You're all good, conscientious pilots for showing up here and listening to me for the last, whatever it was, hour. So.
Thank you.
Enjoy your dinner.
Yep.
All right.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you,
very
Jason.
much.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate your
Thank
comment.
you.